Gene Tierney was sometimes described as a sick rose, and this description is apt. She was worshipped for her staggering beauty, but this adoration was a poisoned chalice. Behind the perfect mask was a woman who was suffering intensely. Very few have appeared more alluring or glamorous than Tierney in Laura or Heaven Can Wait, but the reality was far less glamorous. She endured brutal and barbaric so-called treatments, rejection, and alcoholism. Nonetheless, she produced brilliant performances that won her Oscar nominations. And it wasn't just movie audiences who fell in love with her. Where Marilyn Monroe would later famously tread, Tierney had already been when she seduced the most powerful man in the world. This is the fascinating and ultimately tragic life of Gene Tierney. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Jean Eliza Tierney was born in Brooklyn, New York on November 19, 1920. Her father, Howard, earned his living as a prosperous insurance broker, and her mother, Belle, was a socialite from the well-established Taylor family. Jean, a typical middle child, grew up with an older brother named Butch and a younger sister named Pat. They were raised in the heart of Connecticut's societal circle by their mother. Jean was sent to the prestigious St. Margaret's School in Waterbury, Connecticut, when it was time for her education to begin. Here she excelled and showed a notable talent for poetry. One of her poems, Night, was even featured in the school's newspaper. In 1929, she traveled around Europe with her family, during which she continued her studies under a governess to ensure she could seamlessly continue her education upon returning to America. Back home, she transferred to the Umpqua School in Fairfield, where she developed an interest in acting, taking the lead role of Jo in the school's production of Little Women. At age 15, Tierney's family sent her to Lausanne, Switzerland, to attend the Brillemont International School for 2 years. There, she picked up French and met Hollywood's elite for the first time. Aboard ship on her way back to school, she encountered silent-era superstar Douglas Fairbanks Sr., and they quickly became friends. In 1938, after returning to America, Gene Tierney joined the student body at Miss Porter's school in Connecticut. The curriculum here aimed at grooming the girls for social debuts and prosperous marriages. The expectation was that they would not have to be overly involved in motherhood, as they would have sufficient staff to handle domestic and childcare responsibilities. Their success would depend largely on their charm and beauty. A few years later, Jacqueline Bouvier also graduated from this school. Meanwhile, a certain handsome and brilliant young man was also traveling Europe after spending a summer assisting his former bootlegger father, who was now an American ambassador in London. He would visit the Soviet Union, the Balkans, and the Middle East as he prepared to return to the U.S. and attend Harvard. This man, known to his friends as Jack, would become a very important figure in the emotional lives of both Gene Tierney and Jacqueline Bouvier. At this point, Tierney started questioning if she wanted more from life than just this predetermined path of being a pretty society wife with little to do or say. During a visit to California after graduating, she encountered Anatole Litvak, a prominent Hollywood director. Bowled over by her looks, he declared, "Young woman, you ought to be in pictures." He offered her a chance to screen test for Warner Brothers. Tierney accepted, and to her surprise, the studio wanted to sign her. Her excitement was dampened when her parents, upon hearing the news, insisted she return home for her social debut, instead of pursuing an acting career. Tierney reluctantly complied with her parents' wishes and debuted at the Fairfield County Club on September 24, 1938. She later expressed her loathing of the debutante events, critiquing them as a way fathers rationalized spending all their time at work rather than with their children. After completing the debut season, she broached the topic of acting with her parents again. This time, they consented, but with a condition: it should be in the legitimate theater. Following this, Tierney studied acting in Greenwich Village, New York, under the guidance of the renowned director, Benno Schneider, and later George Abbott. Her father, now aiming to support her properly, established the Belle Tier Company, named after his wife. Tierney then appeared on the Broadway stage in 1938 in a minor role in the comedy What a Life, where she made an impression by simply carrying a bucket of water across the stage. A variety critic remarked, "Miss Tierney is certainly the most beautiful water carrier I've ever seen." She continued to pursue acting, serving as an understudy in The Primrose Path, and by early 1939, she secured a credited role as Molly O'Brien in the stage production of Miss O'Brien Entertains. Tierney's acting continued to attract attention, and Warner Brothers once again extended a contract offer to her. However, she declined this opportunity and instead accepted a 6-month contract with Columbia, where she would earn $350 a week. Interestingly, while cosmetic enhancements would later become commonplace in Hollywood, Tierney's contract explicitly required that she make no changes to her appearance, including not getting braces to correct her slightly protruding teeth, a minor defect that Columbia believed added to her natural beauty rather than detracted from it. Before she transitioned to the film industry, Tierney took to the stage once more, playing Peggy Carr in the 1939 production of Ring 2. One critic confidently stated, "I see no reason why Miss Tierney should not have an interesting theatrical career. That is, if cinema does not kidnap her away. Indeed, cinema would soon claim her." As her profile rose, Tierney became a sought-after figure in the media, featured in publications ranging from Harper's Bazaar to Vogue. It was fitting, then, that soon after she arrived in Hollywood in 1939, her agent, Leland Hayward, introduced her to the famed movie producer, Howard Hughes. Hughes was one of the wealthiest men in the world and a prominent entrepreneur. Despite his celebrity status, Hughes was naturally reclusive. He also kept personal connections under wraps, quite a task given the large number of them. Hughes was notorious for his romantic liaisons, engaging with numerous actresses and starlets, yet maintaining a distant and enigmatic persona, even to those closest to him. He was immediately taken with Tierney, but she saw through his intentions. She later said, "I don't think Howard could have loved anything that didn't have a motor in it." Nonetheless, Hughes, when motivated, would be quite the suitor. In 1939, he invited Tierney and her mother to lunch. Instead of dining locally, he drove them to an airfield, flew them to Tijuana, Mexico, and reserved an entire restaurant where they dined and danced to a live band. After Tierney agreed to date him, Hughes showered her with gardenias filling a room before they went out to dinner. He also provided her brother, Butch, an executive role at Hughes Aircraft. During the summer of 1940, when Tierney suffered from an intestinal issue, Hughes sent his personal doctor to care for her. His many flaws aside, Hughes occasionally showed genuine care and generosity, especially when he felt a real affection for someone. His typical displays of wealth and extravagant gifts didn't impress Tierney, who was accustomed to affluence. She pointedly observed, "Cars, furs, and gems were not my weaknesses." Ultimately, their relationship remained platonic, although Hughes's romantic love for Tierney endured, albeit unrequited. Meanwhile, Tierney's Columbia career had a slow start. Directors often cast her for her looks rather than her acting skills, leading to roles that mainly featured her as decorative. Even though her contract prohibited any alterations to her appearance, a cameraman advised her to slim down to enhance her screen presence. While browsing through Harper's Bazaar, Tierney came across an ad for a miracle diet and decided to try it out. She started the diet and stuck with it throughout her career, later saying, "I followed the same diet for 20 years, eliminating starches, living on salads, lean meat, and small portions." Essentially, she was on the keto diet decades before it became fashionable. But she also admitted, "I love to eat. For all of Hollywood's rewards, I was hungry for most of those 20 years." Frustrated with Columbia's inability to find her a role, she gave up on Hollywood and returned to Broadway in 1940, where she starred in The Male Animal. The play was a smash, and her role was also critically acclaimed. One reviewer noted, "Tierney blazes with animation and the best performance she has yet given." Tierney's Hollywood career might have failed without Daryl Zanuck, who noticed her in The Male Animal. During her performance, Zanuck instructed his assistant to remember her name. That same night at the Stork Club, he saw Tierney again dancing with Robert Morley and eating caviar, her new favorite dish. Not recognizing her from the play, he mistakenly told his assistant, "Forget the girl from the play. See if you can sign that one." A besotted Zanuck later called her the most beautiful woman in movie history. Tierney's debut role at Fox was as Eleanor Stone in The Return of Frank James, but the film and her performance received poor reviews. Tierney was among the harshest critics of her work. She left the premiere feeling horrified at the sound of her own voice on screen, which she likened to Minnie Mouse. Her solution was drastic and deadly. She took up chain smoking. Always a woman of strong appetites and addictive habits, she smoked heavily for the rest of her life. Her first role did not lead to many acting opportunities, so Tierney spent her time socializing in Hollywood. She was frequently seen with leading men, such as Desi Arnaz, Eddie Albert, and Robert Sterling. Tierney's life took a dramatic turn during the 1940 holidays when she met Franco-Russian fashion designer Oleg Cassini at a party hosted by Constance Moore. They connected instantly, and Tierney soon caused a stir in Hollywood by spending New Year's Eve weekend with him. They eloped to Las Vegas on June 1st, 1941, and married in a private ceremony. Tierney was worried about her family's reaction to her marrying a foreigner, and as expected, her parents were appalled and virtually disowned her. When her father also left her mother for another woman, Tierney was devastated. Her father stopped paying her salary from their family company and used the $50,000 she had saved to cover his own business debts. She took legal action, but the family rift was never mended, and they remained estranged for the rest of his life. Her relationship with her mother was also strained. As Tierney recalled, "My mother would not talk to me for weeks, would not stay under my roof for as long as I was married to Oleg." Oleg would also later cross paths with Jacqueline Bouvier, being the designer responsible for the iconic Jackie look that she wore in public throughout her stint as First Lady and beyond. For the first time, Tierney was isolated from Connecticut's elite circles. While this might have felt liberating, it also brought major stress into her life. This sudden, brutal cutoff by her parents led to a mysterious illness that her doctors blamed on stress and allergies. Without her parents' financial support, Tierney now relied solely on her earnings and those of Cassini. In 1941, she managed to get a minor role alongside Paul Mooney in Hudson's Bay, followed by a more significant role in Tobacco Road. However, the critics were not impressed with her performances. Tierney eventually secured a bigger role playing the lead in Belle Starr as a Confederate spy. Nonetheless, the critical reception did not improve. Tierney, always self-aware, later confessed, "The role of a female outlaw was not exactly custom-made for someone recently out of finishing school." Looking back, it's easy to spot some strong negative bias in her reviews at the time, particularly in the New York Times. Her privileged upbringing, beauty, and aspiration to act may have skewed perceptions against her. Her early performances are not brilliant by any stretch, but they are often superior to many other actresses of her era, who are being cut far more slack than Tierney. These merciless, savaging critiques were very much being taken to heart by Gene, who was already beginning to feel the burden of the emotional roller coaster of her life. Tierney's next role was as Zia in Sundown, but once again her performance didn't receive favorable reviews, with the critics stating, "Miss Tierney continues to create a distinct impression of adolescent Weltschmerz." She would later disclose, "Joe Skank once said to me that he really believed I had a future, and that was because I was the only girl who could survive so many bad pictures." However, by December 1941, when the U.S. entered the war, the one positive aspect of Tierney's career was that it had provided a comfortable life in Hollywood for her and Cassini. The reviews for Tierney's performance as Poppy Smith in The Shanghai Gesture were slightly less harsh, but the knives were still out for Gene. One contemporary review declared, "The tip-off on The Shanghai Gesture, which arrived at the Astor yesterday, comes early in the film when Gene Tierney, looking fabulously svelte, enters Madame Gin Sling's enormous casino, a place where the world's paths evidently converge, sniffs the air like a young colt in a new field, and says somewhat blandly to her companion, 'It has a ghastly familiarity, like a half-forgotten dream. Anything could happen here.' Miss Tierney, portraying Poppy, the impulsive moth that gets scorched, delivers a performance akin to a secondary role in a school play. Unfortunately, this was about as kind as they were willing to be towards the 21-year-old actress. Despite these challenges, Tierney continued to work, taking on the role of Eve in Son of Fury, the story of Benjamin Blake, in 1942. This performance was met with some backhanded praise. Miss Tierney, whose acting skills are questionable, is fortunate in this film as she has few lines to deliver. She merely needs to appear voluptuous in Hawaiian print swimsuits. Tierney then played Susan Miller in Rings on Her Fingers, a screwball comedy directed by Ruben Mamoulian, where again the criticism was harsh. Fortunately, her next role, in China Girl, received more favorable comments, with the critic noting, "Miss Tierney portrays her version of a Vassar-educated Chinese girl, largely through sheer stillness, and that's perfectly fine by us." By November 1942, Tierney and Cassini had saved enough to buy a small house and contemplated starting a family. However, their plans were interrupted when Cassini was drafted into the Coast Guard and moved to the cavalry at Fort Riley, Kansas. His posting within the U.S. allowed Tierney to visit him regularly, but the marriage had tempestuous moments. Cassini was known for his jealousy and quick temper. On one occasion, he knocked a photographer to the ground for grabbing Tierney and trying to kiss her, which perhaps led the photographer to think twice before sexually assaulting someone again. While remaining in Hollywood, Tierney continued her acting career, a decision that paid off when she landed the lead role in the successful comedy Heaven Can Wait, directed by the masterful Ernst Lubitsch. Working on the movie was a huge learning experience for Tierney. She later recounted, "Lubitsch was a tyrant on the set, the most demanding of directors. After one particularly long scene, which took from noon until 5 to perfect, I was nearly in tears from Lubitsch's constant shouting. The following day I confronted him, looked him in the eye and told him, 'Mr. Lubitsch, I'm willing to do my best, but I cannot continue with this film if you keep shouting at me.' His response was loud, 'I'm paid to shout at you,' to which I replied, 'Yes, and I'm paid to take it, but not enough.' There was a moment of tension, then Lubitsch laughed. After that, our working relationship improved greatly. Although Lubitsch was a challenging director, his expertise was undeniable, and Heaven Can Wait became a box office hit, earning over $1 million. Ironically, one of Tierney's lines in the movie was, "Don't misunderstand me. I love Kansas. It's just that I don't feel like living there." By the film's release in August 1943, Tierney was in Kansas, living with her husband at the Army base. Yet, just as her career seemed poised for greater success, Gene was hit by a more personal difficulty. In March 1943, upon discovering she was pregnant, she took a break from acting to volunteer at the Hollywood Canteen. This move served as both a patriotic act and a publicity opportunity. But in June 1943, Tierney contracted rubella, also known as German measles. At that time, the potential impacts on her unborn child were not well understood, so she was not overly worried. She even continued her efforts in support of the war before relocating with her husband Cassini to Washington, D.C. There, on October 14, 1943, she gave birth prematurely. Immediately after her daughter, Daria, was born, it became apparent that the infant had serious health issues. She lacked fluid in her middle ear, was blind in one eye, and had significant developmental delays. The situation plunged her into a state of severe anxiety. Gene spent much time walking the hospital corridors, contemplating her next steps. Following a detailed discussion with her husband, they resolved to bring their daughter home and provide her with the best care possible, including professional assistance. Back in Hollywood, Tierney tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, often showing her daughter to the media with evident pride. Tierney learned over a year later from a fan at a party how she had contracted the rubella, which had had such a terrible effect on her unborn daughter's health. The fan excitedly confessed that she had escaped quarantine for German measles 2 years prior because she desperately wanted to meet Tierney, exclaiming, "I just had to go. You were always my favorite." This revelation shocked and angered Gene. She was distraught that such irresponsible behavior and cruel luck had led to such devastating outcomes. Gene would later share this story with the press, which in turn inspired Agatha Christie to incorporate it into her Miss Marple mystery, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. This title references a line from The Lady of Shalott. "The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse has come upon me," cried the Lady of Shalott. This was very much how Gene Tierney was beginning to feel, but it was only going to get worse. Once Daria was settled at home with a nurse, Tierney returned to acting, starring in her most iconic role in the film noir, Laura. The production faced challenges, particularly because the original director, Ruben Mamoulian, failed to effectively guide Tierney and her co-star, Dana Andrews. After seeing the initial footage, Mamoulian was replaced by Otto Preminger, who succeeded in eliciting better performances from the cast. In fact, Preminger transformed Tierney into a world-class actress at last, and she was finally free to express the full range of her talent. Vincent Price had this to say about Laura: "No one but Gene Tierney could have played Laura. There was no other actress around with her particular combination of beauty, breeding, and mystery." Despite this being one of her most acclaimed performances, the New York Times still criticized Tierney's portrayal, commenting, "Tierney's portrayal disappoints. She is certainly pretty, but does not embody the sophisticated image required for an advertising executive, appearing instead with the naive enthusiasm of a college junior." While most raved about her, it was beginning to seem that the New York Times had developed a fixation with destroying Tierney at any and every opportunity. Nonetheless, Laura was a commercial success, earning $1 million at the box office. As the conflict continued in Europe, Tierney was engaged in her own struggle back home, a fight for her daughter's future. At first, it was uncertain how deeply the rubella had affected her daughter's brain, and the child seemed to be developing normally. Over time, however, the severity of the damage became apparent, particularly when she failed to reach developmental milestones, like sitting up or speaking. She couldn't manage basic tasks, like holding a spoon or drinking from a cup, and while her body grew, her mind remained locked in perpetual infancy. When the war concluded in 1945, Oleg Cassini returned to a situation he soon understood would never be ordinary. Cassini, who prided himself on a lineage that traced back to Russian royalty, found he was ill-prepared for life with a less-than-perfect child. He left Tierney and their child in 1946, heartbroken by her husband's departure and the collapsing hopes for her daughter's progress. Tierney immersed herself in her acting career. She appeared as Tina Tomasino in A Bell for Adano, a film that did not meet expectations, yet received some positive feedback from critics. Gene continued her success with one of her most iconic roles as Ellen Barrett Harland in Leave Her to Heaven. She reflected on her character and commented, "That woman was really disturbed. It was a juicy role, the kind Bette Davis might have jumped at, the type of a malicious woman. While I don't think I'm naturally spiteful, it's hard for any actress to turn down such roles." Her performance not only earned Gene her first Oscar nomination, but also won critical acclaim. Many years later, in 2007, Martin Scorsese spoke about his affection for Leave Her to Heaven, saying, "Gene Tierney is one of the most underrated actresses of the golden era." The film was also shot in glorious Technicolor, a fact which finally brought Gene's most stunning physical trait to the world: her eyes. After filming, co-star Vincent Price once again had praise for Gene. He said, "This one is in Technicolor. That means the audiences will also get the full force of those Tierney eyes. Now maybe they'll understand why scriptwriters have me go off the deep end every time I'm in the same picture with her." Tierney and Vincent Price appeared together in Dragonwyck. Still, the reception wasn't as favorable this time, but the film had significant personal meaning for Tierney, as it was during its production that she met a charming Harvard graduate and war hero, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Still reeling from Cassini's betrayal and the challenges with her daughter, she found warmth and comfort in Kennedy's company. They also connected over their shared personal challenges, as Kennedy had a sister, Rosemary, who was mentally disabled following a nurse botching her birth. The oxygen deprivation caused by this led to a series of symptoms similar to those experienced by Daria. However, while Gene had fought Cassini to keep Daria from being institutionalized, no one was able to defend Rosemary. She was sent to various schools for the intellectually disabled, but the Kennedy family have long kept the wagons circled around the truth concerning just how disabled Rosemary really was. It has often been noted that when she was in her big brother John's presence, she was as smart and happy as any other girl her age. John took her to a tea dance, and she was presented as a debutante at Buckingham Palace in 1938, while John was assisting his father's ambassadorial role there. The procedure for debuting in the presence of the British royal family would be enough to test the nerves and competence of the mentally strongest individuals. Nonetheless, Rosemary devoted hours upon hours of practice to the extremely complex curtsy she would have to perform under intense pressure. However, when the big moment came, she lost her balance and stumbled. The Kennedy family acted like nothing had happened, but they were allegedly seriously embarrassed by their daughter's misstep. An interview at this time claimed that Rosemary was aspiring to become involved in social welfare or become a kindergarten teacher, with apparent aspirations to become a theater actress. She was, not unlike a great number of teenagers and people in their early 20s, prone to emotional outbursts, and was also becoming sexually curious. The idea of Rosemary becoming pregnant out of wedlock, catching a sexually transmitted disease, or losing her temper in public was more than Joseph Kennedy could tolerate. In 1941, her parents, Joseph and Rose Kennedy, had her lobotomized in an effort to protect his family's reputation, a reputation that had not been significantly tarnished by Joseph Kennedy's past as an underworld bootlegger during Prohibition. The horrifying and gruesome procedure was performed with only a mild tranquilizer being administered to Rosemary. It was supposed to cure her of depression, but it turned out that drilling a hole in her skull and hacking away at her brain tissue with a butter knife was not a sophisticated means of curing her mental illness. After the medical procedure, it was immediately obvious that it had been a disaster. Rosemary's mental capacity was almost completely diminished, and she had the developmental level of a 2-year-old child. She was incontinent and could no longer walk or speak, merely stand and stare blankly. She was immediately institutionalized and sequestered in a private psychiatric hospital, where she would stay for the rest of her life. Joseph Kennedy then set about launching a major propaganda campaign to ensure that all reporting referred to his daughter as suffering from, in the parlance of the time, mental retardation and not mental illness, as the latter would have reflected extremely poorly on the family, with John now developing serious ambitions of becoming president. While the Kennedy family's secrets remained closely guarded, it is often suggested that John was seriously affected by what his parents did to his sister. This was exactly the kind of outcome Gene Tierney had fought to protect her daughter from, at least so far, and it seems she and Jack Kennedy were able to confide in one another on this painful subject, and even brighten one another's outlook. She would later reminisce. The dialogue with him was always delightful. We had some very good times together. Jack was always solicitous, protective, and concerned about me. When he heard I was ill, he came to see me even after he became a senator and president. When I met Jack Kennedy, he was a serious young man with a dream. He was not a womanizer, not as I understood the term. However, a romantic future with Kennedy was not to be. When Tierney sought a divorce from Cassini, and Kennedy learned of it, he had a serious conversation with her. Tierney remembered. We were having lunch one day in New York. He looked at me and said, out of the blue, "You know, Gene, I can never marry you." I sat still, and in a voice just above a whisper, I said, "Bye-bye, Jack." While involved with Kennedy, Tierney's film career continued. She landed the lead in The Razor's Edge. Somerset Maugham, who admired Tierney and was a close friend, wrote the role of Isabel Bradley Maturin specifically for her. It turned out that much of Maugham's screenplay was altered in the final film. The movie wasn't a major success, but it allowed Tierney to grow close to her co-star, Tyrone Power. Despite Power's affection for her, Tierney, still involved with Kennedy, insisted they remain just friends, a decision that would maintain their friendship for years. Tierney then starred in The Ghost and Mrs. Muir the following year, playing a widow haunted by a sea captain's ghost. One critic commented, "Gene Tierney plays Mrs. Muir in what by now may be called her customary inexpressive style. She is a pretty girl, but has no depth of feeling as an actress." Tierney's separation from Kennedy marked a downturn in her life. Disappointed in love once more, she chose to sell her Hollywood home and return to her mother's residence in Connecticut. It was there, under familial pressure, that she made the painful decision to enroll her struggling daughter Daria in a school for children with mental disabilities. Howard Hughes stepped in during Tierney's medical and personal turmoil, covering her substantial medical bills and arranging specialist care for her daughter. Tierney remembered, "The emptiness inside me was like a cave. She was a sweet little girl, with golden curls and soft skin. I cried for Daria, and I cried for myself, until I couldn't tell the source of my tears." In early 1948, while finalizing their divorce, Tierney and Cassini resumed sleeping with each other. Even as their divorce was finalized in March 1948, they discovered shortly after that Tierney was expecting again. Filled with joy at the news, the couple welcomed another daughter, Christina, on November 19, 1948. They were now reconciled and later remarried. Tierney returned to the screen in Whirlpool in 1949, where her performance was met with mixed reviews. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times once again critiqued her role harshly, stating, "You'd better see this one in a state of trance." Whirlpool was a fairly accurate description of Tierney's turbulent life at the time. After Daria's institutionalization, Tierney's depression deepened, with limited treatments available for bipolar disorder and considerable stigma still attached. She relied heavily on her friends within the film industry for support. Daryl Zanuck cast her as Mary Bristol in Night in the City. After this shoot, Zanuck was particularly concerned about her well-being, suspecting she might be suicidal, and believed that working might offer some relief. Indeed, Tierney found solace in acting, stating, "As long as I was playing someone else, everything was fine. It was when I had to be myself that the problems began." While in London for the film, she dined with Clifton Webb, who introduced her to Marlene Dietrich, whom she had met previously through Dietrich's daughter. Back in the United States, Tierney's career moved forward, and in 1951, she took on the role of Lily Duran in On the Riviera. This time, even the New York Times conceded that her performance surpassed the film's merits. Subsequently, Tierney and Ray Milland were lent by Fox to Warner Brothers for Close to My Heart, where they portrayed a couple struggling with infertility who decided to adopt. Taking on such a role, given Tierney's anguish over her daughter Daria, was profoundly painful for her and might have contributed to her eventual nervous breakdown. Tierney tried to manage her sorrow by keeping busy and continued acting, traveling to Argentina in 1951 to film Way of a Gaucho. During her stay, she leveraged her societal status and celebrity to spend the Christmas holidays with Prince Ali Khan amidst his tumultuous divorce from actress Rita Hayworth. This romantic and exciting escape behind her, Tierney now faced difficulties back at home. Cassini, increasingly distant, spent less time with the family, leading Tierney to file for divorce again a few years after they remarried. In their divorce agreement, Cassini vowed to leave half his estate to their daughters upon his death, a promise he later reneged on, though Tierney, who passed away before him, never knew he would fail to keep his word. Nonetheless, they maintained a friendship for the remainder of her life. Following her divorce, Tierney was cast as Dorothy Bradford in Plymouth Adventure, in which she was described rather curiously as a firm pillar of well-starched ladyhood. She engaged in a brief, intense romance with co-star Spencer Tracy during the production. He later reflected, although she was beautiful in her films, they couldn't quite capture all of her. Fortunately, I did, even if it was late in my life. The role of a woman who ends her life by her own hand at the film's conclusion might have resonated with Tierney during a tumultuous period in her life, or perhaps it served as a cathartic expression of her deep-seated feelings. Regardless, the film performed modestly at the box office. Even while busy as an actress, Tierney maintained an active social life. In April 1952, film producer Dor Sherry invited her to an MGM luncheon where she met Queen Juliana and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. By this time, Tierney had become a familiar face at events featuring royalty, a testament to her ease in the company of the affluent and influential. Unlike many of her Hollywood peers, who came from simpler backgrounds and often felt uncomfortable in such elite circles, Tierney's poise made her a sought-after guest. In 1953, Tierney reconnected with Prince Ali Khan in Paris, and they began dating. She owned a home in London where she frequently entertained, and Khan quickly became a regular visitor. Eventually, Tierney left her London residence to rent a place close to Khan's on the French Riviera. Tierney described her role in Khan's social circle, saying, "I was his hostess at receptions. His parties were the beginning of the jet set. It was easy to be dazzled at first by that role, greeting his important and sometimes royal friends." In May 1953, during Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, Khan secured a suite on the parade route, costing nearly $10,000 a night in 1953 money, but it gave them a spectacular view of the festivities. Shortly after the coronation, Khan proposed to Tierney. He then flew to consult with his father, Aga Khan III, the leader of the Ismaili Muslims. However, Aga Khan disapproved of the union and demanded that his son abandon his divorce proceedings and reconcile with his wife, stating primly, "If he marries Miss Tierney, I will not receive her." Khan was not so easily put off, and he traveled to London where Tierney was filming Personal Affair. The film was successful, receiving favorable reviews in the UK and the US. Bosley Crowther finally gave her some credit, writing, "Gene Tierney as the schoolmaster's wife goes at this delicate subject in a taut and solemn way." Tierney also starred alongside Clark Gable in Never Let Me Go. Even though viewers praised the on-screen chemistry, Tierney admitted she had no romantic interest in Gable. By 1954, Khan had finalized his divorce from Hayworth, clearing the way for him and Tierney to marry, but another obstacle emerged. Upon learning of Tierney's public relationship with Khan, Cassini sought custody of their younger daughter, Tina, through the courts. At this point, Tierney realized that a lasting relationship with Khan was impossible, prompting her return to America to settle in Connecticut. On the other hand, Khan became his father's ambassador to Pakistan and relocated to Karachi. Despite his responsibilities, he frequently returned to Hollywood, often visiting Tierney on set whenever possible, but they were doomed to never fully realize their love. She was struggling on, but by now, Gene Tierney was at a breaking point. Despite her efforts to keep up appearances, Tierney's life was unraveling. By 1955, during the filming of Left Hand of God with Humphrey Bogart, familiar with personal struggles, Bogart noticed Tierney's distress and alerted Fox executives, suggesting she needed support. However, used to dealing with temperamental actors, they dismissed his concerns, saying that Gene is a trooper. Tierney herself once observed, eccentric behavior is not routinely noticed around a movie set, and also remarked, it was the fashion of the time, still is, to feel that all actors are neurotic, or they would not be actors. Indeed, Tierney was professional on set, always delivering her best performance in front of the camera, but once filming ceased and the studio lights dimmed, her internal darkness overwhelmed her, making even simple daily tasks challenging. As Hollywood rumors spread about her deteriorating condition, friends who visited were turned away because she failed to recognize them. At times, it seemed she struggled with her vision, unable to see who or what was before her. Those who managed to reach her found she had no memory of their conversations. Just days later, increasingly paranoid, she secluded herself, convinced that she was a subject of public scrutiny and gossip. She later clarified, my departure from Hollywood was described as a walkout. No one understood that I was cracking up. Hollywood can be hard on women, but it did not cause my problems. Hoping that exchange of scenery might improve her condition, Khan planned an extended trip for them. When he requested a break from Fox for her, the studio denied the leave and instead suspended her, a very common practice at the time. If Tierney had returned refreshed and ready to work, the studio would likely have resumed her contract with minimal fuss, extending it to compensate for the lost time. However, upon her return to Hollywood, Tierney was not improved and could not work. Eventually, her family was informed of her situation, leading her brother to fly to Hollywood. Realizing she needed professional care, he took her back to New York City and checked her into an expensive sanitarium. Unfortunately, this move made things even worse for her. She would later describe her experience there with regret, saying, "There, to my eternal regret, I received my first electric shock therapy. It was the most degrading time of my life. I felt like a lab rat." At that time, electric shock therapy was considered a leading treatment for mental illness, and has even seen a 21st century resurgence. However, in the 1950s, the method was crude and often barbaric. Tierney was restrained in a chair, a padded stick placed between her teeth. At the same time, electricity coursed through her body, causing her to urinate involuntarily and suffer from blackouts, with no memory of the events afterward. During these sessions, she desperately tried to persuade the doctors to release her, employing pleas, threats, and even flirtation, but the terrifying and excruciating torture continued. Tierney was also subjected to other contemporary treatments for mood stabilization. Believing that high body temperatures could trigger mania, doctors sometimes wrapped her in frozen sheets for extended periods. Although some treatments momentarily eased her symptoms, the relief was short-lived, prompting repeated and dreaded interventions. Not to mention, they were quite expensive. Seeing no lasting improvement, her family decided to move her to the Institute for Living in Hartford, Connecticut, where she underwent similar treatments under new supervision. This established a cyclical pattern of breakdowns, treatments, temporary recoveries, releases, and inevitable relapses at her mother's home. Tierney's mental health reached its lowest point in the spring of 1957, when she contemplated ending her life. Living with her mother in a 14th floor New York apartment, she recounted in her autobiography how she found herself on the window ledge. Slowly, I swung myself out of bed, walked into the living room, and raised the window. The next thing I knew, I was on the ledge. It was hardly more than just 2 feet wide. I kept my arms and back pressed against the building, my fingers digging into the rough surface. But I felt almost serene. I must have stood there for 20 minutes. I was totally without fear, and I thought, what's the point of living? She later admitted that vanity stopped her from jumping, as she thought about the gruesome aftermath of such a fall. I thought of what I'd look like when I hit the ground, like a scrambled egg. That didn't appeal to me. If I was going to die, I wanted to be in one piece. Embarrassed by her actions, Tierney told the responding police officers that she was cleaning the windows when they arrived at the scene. Naturally, her explanation was met with skepticism, and her family urged her to seek treatment once again. This time, however, her brother conducted thorough research and discovered that the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, was renowned worldwide for its psychiatric care. At Menninger, Tierney found a calm environment where she was encouraged to discuss her feelings and learn coping mechanisms for her condition. She later shared, "My doctors say that my career had absolutely nothing to do with my illness. They tell me I handled it as a mature person. Perhaps the most important lesson I had to learn was to admit and accept defeat. In the past, I felt I had to stand up to any situation and take it. I felt I had to put up with the impossible and try to resolve it. I had to learn to say, I can't solve that. I give up." Feeling somewhat stronger, Tierney didn't return to Hollywood, but took a job at Talmadge's ladies' apparel shop in Westboro, Kansas. This job allowed her to live independently while continuing therapy at the clinic. However, this arrangement ended abruptly when the press discovered her whereabouts and began visiting the shop to harass her. Although upset about the intrusion into her private life, Tierney chose to speak openly about her condition, which became a crucial step in her recovery, and in fact, contributed to broader mental health awareness. By fall of 1958, feeling better, Tierney, accompanied by her mother and Tina, vacationed in Aspen, Colorado. She told the press, "The doctors told me, if you break an arm or a leg, it takes months for it to really heal and years for it to be the same again. So you can imagine the problems with a broken mind. Of course, knowing the trouble is going to come back isn't easy, but I just have to face that fact and know I'll muddle through. Everybody's pulling for me. I'm as happy as I can be. Even the voices that I hear are sweet." There she met W. Howard Lee, a wealthy Texas oilman who was finalizing a costly divorce from actress Hedy Lamarr. Initially reluctant to meet another actress, Lee changed his mind after meeting Tierney and was quickly enchanted by her charm and beauty. Lee's affection alone couldn't shield Tierney from her ongoing challenges, particularly during the stressful holiday season. Recognizing her need for help, she voluntarily checked herself back into Menninger's on Christmas Day, 1958. She spent nearly a year in treatment, during which Lee flew in to visit her every other weekend from Houston. After her release in November 1959, Tierney moved back in with her mother. In her ongoing effort to reintegrate into society, Tierney revisited her acting career in 1959 when Fox cast her in Holiday for Lovers. Initially, she felt ready to return to work, but soon found the stress overwhelming and withdrew from the project, checking herself back into Menninger's once again. In 1960, she ventured back into acting with a less demanding role on the episode of the General Electric Theater, hosted by Ronald Reagan. Tierney married Lee on July 11, 1960, in a quiet Aspen ceremony. Lee's decision to marry someone grappling with mental health issues surprised many, but not Tierney, who reflected, "Howard likes to take care of people he cares for. The only time I was really happy was in my childhood, and now." Despite being able to return to acting, Tierney was aware that her life would always have elements of instability, and she committed herself to understanding her condition as best as she could. She acknowledged, "It is difficult to write about any form of mental disease, especially your own, without sounding as if you were examining a bug under glass. Throughout her life, Tierney dealt with sporadic episodes of delusion, sometimes believing she was pregnant and consequently consuming large quantities of food to gain weight. Other times she wandered around her Houston neighborhood, searching for her daughter Daria. These episodes, however, would pass, and she would regain her clarity. Tierney described these moments of recovery as if a curtain were lifted, saying to her husband, "Howard, have I been sick?" To which she would respond, "Oh boy, have you ever?" And they would both laugh it off. She developed a deep understanding of her illness, and then of herself, and like always refused to blame anyone for her troubles but herself. She said, "My illness was a curable one, not cancer or something worse. It was something I was responsible for, not anyone else's fault. More than anything, I learned that the mind is the most beautiful part of the body, and I am grateful to have mine back." Tierney's attempt to return to film was tough. In 1962, she accepted the lead role and returned to Peyton Place, but had to withdraw due to pregnancy, which sadly enough ended in a miscarriage at about 20 weeks. She then threw herself into Advise and Consent, her fourth and final film with Preminger. While many critics appreciated Tierney's performance, Crowther continued his pattern of harsh critiques, leading one film historian to comment, "Gene Tierney returns to the screen after 7 years' absence undergoing psychiatric treatment, which probably included recovering from endless caustic comments from Bosley Crowther throughout her career. He never had a nice word for her, ever. I wonder if she just rolled her eyes at every New York Times review. Crowther just relentlessly had it in for her. No matter what she did, she must have snubbed him at a party as a starlet." Which, as a critique of a critic, is both scathing and seemingly close to the truth. While Advise and Consent didn't rekindle Tierney's film career, it facilitated reunion with Jack Kennedy. Shortly after its release in June 1962, the now President Kennedy and the First Lady invited Tierney and her husband to a White House lunch. Sitting next to Kennedy, she had the chance to revisit old times. Being around Kennedy's famously charismatic personality was a major tonic for Gene. But only a year and a half later, she would watch in horror, along with the rest of the world, as her former love had his brains blown out on TV. Tierney completed another film, Toys in the Attic, in 1963, and starred in The Pleasure Seekers the following year, after which she retired from the film industry. 5 years later, she briefly returned to the screen alongside Ray Milland in the TV drama Daughter of the Mind. In the following years, Tierney split her time between Houston and a condominium in Delray Beach, Florida, living by her philosophy that wealth, beauty, and fame are transient. When those are gone, little is left except the need to be useful. She chose to express this usefulness by penning her autobiography. When Self-Portrait was released in 1979, mental illness was still a largely taboo subject. Tierney's candid discussion of her challenges opened dialogue about mental health at a time when it was much needed. Tierney's final acting role came in 1980 with the TV miniseries Scruples. Her book's release and role in the series brought her back into the public eye, leading to appearances on several TV talk shows. She might have continued in the public sphere had her husband's health not suddenly declined. Following his death in February 1981, she chose a life away from the spotlight, spending her remaining years in seclusion in Houston. Tierney's death on November 6, 1991, was a final insult from Hollywood. Her heavy smoking led to emphysema that severely impaired her health and contributed to her death at the age of 70. Gifted with aqua blue, cat-like eyes and an uncannily symmetrical face, she had an almost doll-like appearance, complemented by the era's iconic red lips. Despite her striking looks, she fought against being stereotyped by her beauty throughout her career, famously stating, "I simply did not want my face to be my talent." Tierney had a particular affinity for film noir, perhaps because the darkness in her own life lent authenticity to her performances in the genre. Watching her in Laura leaves an unforgettable impression. The film tells the story of a detective whose fascination with a murdered woman deepens after he sees a painting of her. It echoes the themes of many mysterious sensual tales of sex and death that followed, from Hitchcock's Vertigo to several of David Lynch's films. Laura holds a special place in cultural memory, precisely due to the painting of Tierney. Her beauty, eternally preserved, avoids the real-life inevitabilities of aging and death. This seems like a poignant metaphor for how a movie star's allure can be perpetually immortalized on film. Despite being underrated and often unfairly criticized, Gene Tierney broke ground in understanding mental health issues and is forever memorable for her enigmatic and often brilliant roles. If you've enjoyed this long look at the life of Gene Tierney and want to help support the channel, then please consider becoming a YouTube member or joining our Patreon. Starting from $1 a month, you'll get access to exclusive content like photos and mini essays on the history of Tinseltown. Check out our $3 membership or Patreon tier for our Hollywood History series, for example. Links are in the description, and any amount is a huge help when it comes to keeping the channel going. We are very grateful. That's all for this episode of Hollywood Mysteries. Sweet dreams.